Welcome, everybody. My name is Seth Boakley. I am the writer in residence at the Sovereign Nature Initiative, and I also tend to be the MC and host for these kinds of talks that we have monthly. This month's talk is a theory talk with our very own Andrea Leiter. I will introduce you and then pass the microphone to you. Andrea Leiter is an assistant professor at the Amsterdam Center for International Law and a co-founder and the director of research at the Sovereign Nature Initiative. Her research focuses on technology-enabled governance and is embedded in the Sustainable Global Economic Law Project. She researches on global inequality and transnational law making through private actors with a focus on the digital economy and blockchain technology in particular. And she's joined by Laura Grant, who is a research fellow and will be helping with the presentation that you've prepared. We will have a presentation, probably half an hour long or so, and then we'll have a conversation with Andrea. And I really invite, as always, with these conversations, your engagement throughout the presentation in the chat, and that you gather your questions, observations, thoughts. I really love it when these are intellectually adventurous conversations, let's say, and to take advantage of the amazing minds that have gathered today and hear your big ideas in response to Andrea. So I think that's enough from me. I'm going to pass it to you. Take it away, Andrea and Laura.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Seth, for this. And actually, I also do have to say it's really very nice to have the whole SNI team here and to speak for the research that we do at SNI, which is a very collaborative, collective effort. I also see here Daniela Gandorfer, who supported me in writing this talk. So it's really a collective engagement that we did here. Okay, so let's get started. A token for nature, question mark. A provocation, as it was announced in one of the tweets advertising this event. A token for nature is precisely the site of engagement that Sovereign Nature Initiative is working on. Proposing a token for nature sounds like a fantastic idea to some and like a nightmare to others. Some people associated with great potential of revaluing nature to acknowledge the centrality of the living ecosystem, planet Earth. Others hear the latest attempt at a further commodification of natural resources to advance the ongoing extraction and exploitation now under the framework of a new token economy. Sovereign Nature Initiative is dedicated to work on and within this field of tensions and pitfalls to walk a difficult path of transformation, creation, and reflection. Far from being straightforward, to ask what a token for nature could be this day and age weaves together a number of strands and developments that otherwise rarely meet. Sovereign Nature Initiative is unique because it draws together modes of thinking from artistic writing, immersive art, Web3 development, and academic research on governance, law, and political ecology. This combination allows us to develop and to build, to sense and to reflect, and to break through conceptual boundaries in tech, art, and thought. SNI combines these streams into applied research that is site-specific, comes from within, without accepting the constraints and limitations of previous projects. So how to engage creatively, and I mean both in the sense of creating and in the sense of creativity, with the looming question of how to configure the intersection between ecology, technologies, and token economics. To start with the ending, speaking of a token for nature or a nature token comes with a heavy conceptual baggage, and the tangents to take from this provocation are going into many directions. The question SNI is asking is, how far can we push the conceptual boundaries of tokens without falling back onto familiar tropes? Let's try and unweave these threads to locate the work of SNI and bring to the fore the uniqueness of the research that we do. The first and most immediate association relates to the regenerative finance. Those versed in the crypto space know the ideas, propositions, and institutions circulating under the banner of regenerative finance. Broadly speaking, regenerative finance in crypto is an attempt to funnel investments into ecological projects. The most famous projects at the moment, such as Regen Network or Toucan, have started their work on on-chain carbon credits, and KlimaDAO with a currency backed by carbon assets. So-called ReFi projects are often inspired by ecosystem service approaches that estimate the cost of a service that nature is providing. Tracing back to a 2005 report initiated by former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan on Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, the approach has become a very popular. The approach has become very popular as an attempt to account for the benefits people obtain from ecosystems. The main idea behind these approaches is to include thus far invisible services of what is assumed to be nature into cost calculations. In doing so, ecosystem service approaches currently play a major role in environmental policy. On the downside, however, they have also been criticized as anthropocentric, relying not only on a dichotomous, but also exploitative relationship between humans and nature as service for human life. Indeed, one of the strongest critiques is the treatment of nature as an object to be mastered by humans, which of course is the very mindset responsible for human-induced climate change, reaching far into sciences, philosophy, and everyday life. One response to these shortcomings is the invocation of rights of nature. Here, nature features not as an object of human control, but as a legal subject in its own right. The proposition was popularized in the 1970s with Christopher Stone's book, Should Trees Have Standing? But it was only in the 2000s that a number of national legal systems have adopted rights of nature. Most famously, the landmark decision of Ecuador in 2008 to formally recognize the rights of nature within its constitution, and Bolivia's law on the rights of Mother Earth. By now, 17 countries have adopted similar laws awarding ecosystems legal personhood status. However, whilst granting nature legal standing can be considered a productive step towards reconfiguring human-nature relations, questions remain unsolved. How, for example, does the impact of legal standing translate into reality? Can we imagine legal and social relations between what is considered to be human and nature without presupposing an inherent divide? Without forcing modes of existence into subjects and objects of law and mastery? How can nature be sovereign? It is precisely here that SNI and its unique approach comes in. On a fundamental level, SNI is dedicating to pushing these approaches further, beyond the current constraints that have been brought to the fore in critiques of both the ecosystem service literature as well as the rights of nature discourse. What these systems have in common is that they operate as modes of meaning-making. Ecosystem services is a mode of economic thought. The rights of nature discourse is a mode of legal thought. Language itself is a mode of thought, as is mathematics or science. These modes of thought create the kind of relationality that underwrites what is considered to be there, the real, what can be known about it, and how it can be expressed. These expressions render the relationality so created legible. Let me try to make this as simple as possible by example of law, since this is the discipline I was trained in. Law operates with a number of key concepts, arguably the most important one being that of a dichotomy between a legal subject and a legal object. A particular object is ascribed into a relation with a particular subject. For example, Alessandro Mazzi owns a surfboard. This relationship has come into being via another foundational legal instrument, namely the contract. Now, for this relationality to be meaningful, both Alessandro Mazzi and the surfboard need to be understood as individualized entities. Alessandro has agentive capacity, whereas the surfboard is inanimate matter. But this is so, you might want to say. What's the problem? It is, I would agree, if you accept the constraints that come with the mode of legal thought. Now, certainly, challenging the very assumption of subjects and objects as prime entities does not only challenge the legal mode of thought, but almost any Western mode of thought, including science. Let's try and consider an example that makes this thought experiment easier and brings it closer to the work at SNI. How to engage nature in a legal mode of thought. Two problems arise that both relate to the relationality to be expressed. In order to assign either subjecthood or objecthood, a subject or object has to be delineated, has to be defined with clear-cut boundaries. Now, where does one thing start and another end? Where does a tree start and where does it end? Is the mycorrhizal network part of it? How about the CO2 and oxygen that are being transformed? Secondly, is the tree a subject or an object? If considered a subject of law, now finally delineated, how does the tree express its agentiality? How does the tree exert its rights? To be clear, various scholars, activists, and policymakers have suggested responses to the questions in the form that I posed them. They have come up with an account of how to delineate something, to define it, and to give it an identity. And they have suggested modes for how to exert rights. Mostly these modes of exerting agency are mediated through a human guardian, as is the case in the commonly referred to example of the Wanganui River, in New Zealand. In these cases, a human is designated to represent the river's interests. But these responses accept the limits of the framework of a legal mode of thought as it stands and search for answers that leave the fundamental categories intact, that try to make the real fit into the established categories. If law demands a subject and an object, a subject and an object it shall have. Thinking beyond legal subjects and objects is really hard, or much rather thinking beyond subjects and objects in most modes of thought is really hard. Thinking of relational agency rather than subject-based agency is even harder. All these questions are questions of representation, a mode of knowing that separates the physical world from how we make sense of it through language, mathematics, images, and symbols. The reason to engage with questions of representation is precisely to understand their limitations and thus to be able to push them, break them, or reconceptualize them. To express SNI's ambition in research in simple terms, we are not ready to accept the limitations of assuming separated entities that would, on their best day, be described in terms of legal subjectivity. We engage technology, arts, theory, and economics in seeking expressions of relationality and entanglement that can radically alter the very understanding of normativity and ethics, of what it means to cohabit or live together. What is key in this rethinking is that the conceptualization of relationality is intimately linked to questions of value creation, distribution, and flow. Since day one, SNI has been chasing the question of how to reconceptualize value, trying to flip the economics. So what can it mean to flip the economics? It means to inquire into the potential of expressing value in tokens in a relational, non-extractive, and non-exploitative mode that could fundamentally address the climate crisis by reconfiguring the basic units of value. This is a radical and extremely challenging proposition. It draws on the multiple functionalities of tokens and the way in which they continue to develop further. It is also inspired by process philosopher Brian Masumi advancing the idea to digitally codify offline qualities and affects so that they can be tokenized as a unit of cryptocurrency. The idea is that crypto tokens might be used to expand cryptocurrencies beyond the conventional individual market fundamentalist transaction-based functions of money. Such an expansion could be achieved through expressing qualitative value, meaning non-transactional value. The very notion of transaction, as we know it through contract, is one that is embedded in a mode of thought that thinks entities first and relations second. To challenge this depends on rethinking the categories of subject and object, as I mentioned above. If successful, tokens could become the linkage between the current capitalist economy and an alter economy built on qualitative value. This vision is difficult to express since it has yet to be invented. and pushes us to the limits of our imagination. SNI faces these limits head on and tries to advance thinking and practice to go beyond them. To bring it all together, here's the challenge. What about this token for nature? As it stands, tokens are considered to relate to entities, to denote either a particular object, as is the case with NFTs, or to denote a unit of account that stores value. But what if tokens could become expressive of relationality? What would such tokenness look like? What if value was not pertaining to something or someone, but to togetherness? If no entity holds value, how can we conceptualize value in flux? This is where we are at. In the past year, we identified the questions and the sites of engagement that are guiding the research, and we are devising research formats that can foster the necessary collaboration. Research at SNI is always site-specific, moving away from individualized units of representation means engaging with emplaced material conditions. This year, we are collaborating with the Kövel, a former shipyard that has been transformed into a clean tech playground through community-driven development. With the environmentally devastating impacts resulting from the industrial practices, in 2012, a multidisciplinary Amsterdam-based group won a municipality competition to turn the site into one of Europe's most sustainable and unique urban developments. 10 years later, the Kövel remains a multifunctional, sustainable space hosting social and creative enterprises in reused houseboats. SNI is proud to inhabit one of these boats as our Amsterdam office. At the Kövel, we are hosting the first experimental zone event on 21st May. This will be an all-day celebration, conversation, and laboratory showcasing emerging ideas at the intersection of Web3, ecology, art, and theory. It will also showcase projects and prototypes that were developed during the site-specific hackathon that took place in February this year, and that we are now developing further in the Germinator program. We also just concluded the Nature Speaks writing competition, challenging creative writers to express the difficulty of imagining a non-human perspective in writing, in prose or poetry. We also support the theory hacks, jointly organized by researchers of the University of Tilburg, the University of Amsterdam, and the Logische Fantasie Lab, Dr. Marie Petersmann, Dr. Daniela Gandorfer, and myself. And the Theory Hacks Collective is composed of legal researchers specialized in environmental and digital humanities and tech developers. Over the past 6 months, the Theory Hacks Collective used the site of the Kövel and its phytoremediation process for removing toxic metals from the polluted soil through the Brassica plant as an entry door to work on radical contracting, how to create value metabolisms. The final workshop will be held on 19 May 2022. So research at SNI is done in collaboration with within a wide network of techno-ecologists, research activists, and art expressionists. With Nature Cognita, one of our first collaborators, we explore data collecting and NFT producing plans. With partners like Momenti Notes and an artist collective Werk, we like to think about treeness in the metaverse. With the crypto arts collective Codex Diagrams, we are working through what it can mean to tokenize a breath. And with the De Kövel collective, we try to find out how a crypto wallet can be connected to a living ecosystem. To put it in a nutshell, research at SNI is engaging some of the most difficult questions about how to reconceptualize ways of living responsibly on planet Earth. We believe in the potential of Web3 technologies to play a key role in revaluing value, in flipping the economics, in moving from an entity-driven understanding of value toward one that goes beyond exploitation and extraction. If you're intrigued, provoked, or in any way moved by these questions, come and join us in trying to work through them together. Thank you very much.
Nice. Thank you so much, Andrea. Lovely. And there's so much in what you just presented. I have a feeling that folks tuning in will have questions, both following up on the projects that we are undergoing at SNI, as well as your research and the intellectual kind of exploration that you just took us down into, like a rabbit hole of concepts that are so rich that I'm really eager to unpack them with you. And so I would love to have a little conversation now, with this whole group, really to open the floor. But I want to mention as well, like we do have the benefit of our whole Sovereign Nature Initiative team, or much of our team, being here today. And so I think maybe let's separate the conversation into, we can talk about those projects that you mentioned, especially at the end, and what SNI's work is, given again that we're all kind of here, and we can answer questions about what we're up to, or maybe even give a bit further updates. And then also separate that, and then we have just a conversation as well about the theory part, the sort of substance of that, first part of your lecture, where you're really digging into these questions of, what is qualitative value, what is how might a token for nature work. So if it's okay, maybe let's start there and kind of ask folks that have tuned in, if you have questions for Andrea about this concept, a token for nature, ? Type them in the chat. I wanted to ask, if I can ask you, just to kick things off, Andrea, you used the phrase qualitative value. And I just think that's such a wonderful provocation. In other words, even the phrase itself, not to get overly semantic about it, but, quality almost feels like it is the opposite of quantification, if that makes sense. So it almost feels like a contradiction in terms to say qualitative value. And so maybe I wanted to ask if you could just talk a little bit about, as a thinker and as somebody from the field of law, which tends to be a little bit less, of a quantification field of thought, as opposed to economics or some of these currencies that we're learning about. Like, how do you see the tension between how tokens tend to be all about numbers and putting numbers to value versus qualities? And how do you see yourself as a sort of lawyer or somebody trained in law, approaching the question of, should we convert everything to numbers? Should we convert value, even qualitative value? Could it be converted to numbers? It seems like crypto is always trying to put a number on things. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you asked the most difficult question into the get-go. What is this idea of qualitative value, and how does that work? And it's really, I think we are far from being able to respond to that properly in a meaningful way. So I think the idea is really to try and go toward and to think toward that, and to go from this concept of quantification that you also invoked is in the crypto space at the moment. I think that what we are really seeing is that the way value is being considered is through you would call that a subjective theory of value, in the sense of a theory of value that says value is defined through a price mechanism. So there's demand and supply, and that somehow meets in this open, efficient market, and then out there comes a number, and that is the value of the thing. And this is really like a number question. So I think when we speak quantification and value, then price is one of the things that is the first thing to consider. And here the question becomes, how can you at least complicate that? So if it is a value that is numerical, does it always have to be in monetary terms? Are there other measures of registers of value that we could think of? So in a sense, I think what I'm trying to say is quantification as a mode of expressing, I think, is something that we will not be able to do away with, but I think that we can multiply it and have much more different registries of value sensing and value expressing. And I think then the other question of the notion of quality versus quantity has a little bit to do with the question of representation and the way representation is considered. And as I tried to express in the talk, or as I said in the talk, it's really the idea that there is a certain realm of thought in which either symbols or words or numbers or whatever else you might park there is the thing that is meaning making, is one of the big troubles at the moment, that there is such a divide or parallelism between what is the real and the world of thought and mind. And so I think that here another way to speak about what is qualitative value would be to try and come to ways of expressing value that do not rely on these representational terms as we are familiar with. If that makes sense to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this question of quality and quantity is super interesting in terms of sometimes I feel like in law and in regulation, it feels like numbers are a necessary evil. Like in a regulation scheme, let's say an oil company is punished for spilling oil, and maybe they're given a punitive number of what what damage they caused, and they have to pay back. So it's like the numbers come at the end, if that makes sense. We have a goal, which is to get oil companies to behave better, and then this number comes at the end. But it's just really interesting to me that here we often feel like in this world of crypto and Web3, the numbers and the data kind of seem to come first. And it's like, how do we process this mountain of data that's coming at us in terms of sensing and in terms of representation, even in terms of the number of trees in a forest, for example, and how to represent their relationality, as you say, as a token with the other organisms that might be around them. So it's interesting how the numbers here seem to kind of come earlier, perhaps, than in some other modes of thinking about law.
Yeah, and I mean, I do think that one of the things to keep in mind or to take into account, I think, is in this flood of data points, it really becomes the question of what are these data points standing in for? What are they meant to convey? So there is a translation happening already in interpreting these data points, and it's not necessarily only about how to execute that well or how to order them well, but really to try and think about what is the sensing, and then sensing technologies have their particular way of how they represent whatever it is that is in the soil or in the air into a dashboard, into numbers that then become legible in a very particular way. But already in that, there are so many layers that construct that dashboard in the first place that it's not the dashboard that is the starting place.
Yeah. Well, on that point and I want to mention too, if you no need to, but if you do want to talk in more detail about the Breath for Sale project, I think that could be maybe an example to dig into. Again, only if you want to get into that today. I also wanted to flag this comment from Alex, asking how does the premise of tokenizing nature reconcile with the carbon emissions associated with blockchain? There's a question that we get quite a bit, as you can imagine, at Sovereign Nature Initiative, and I'd love to ask Andrea, or really anybody here from SNI, to sort of speak to how we are currently thinking about sort of blockchain and carbon, if folks have a comment that they want to add.
I mean, I do think that the go-to answer that probably everyone has heard before is that there is a big difference between proof of work consensus mechanism and proof of stake consensus mechanism, and that the proof of work mechanism is really very, very, very energy intensive and carbon heavy. Whereas the proof of stake mechanism is comparable to any kind of other tech undertaking, any kind of other computation. And I don't know, I mean, the numbers diverge there in wildest ways, and don't take that as a research number. But what I have picked up from conversations is that the proof of stake blockchains use 99.9% less energy than the proof of work blockchains such as Bitcoin and currently Ethereum. So I think that that is something where we at SNI very explicitly work with and on ecosystems that work with proof of stake to tackle that part as well as we can. But yeah, I don't know, Alex, if you meant to go into a further direction with this, or if this proof of stake, proof of work differentiation answers your question.
Hi, sorry, no, I'm just keeping off my video because my internet connection is so poor here. But thank you. No, I didn't actually know about that distinction at all. So that's very helpful. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah, it's great. I think it's a good point to look into proof of stake, proof of work, and it's something that's very much hot and on the minds of folks in the Web3 community right now. So there is a much larger conversation, perhaps outside of today's, that I would encourage folks to dig into. And if folks from our team have links, feel free to put them in the chat for some really important conversations that are happening about carbon and the Web3 space. I want to mention too, Anne-Marie, popped in with a comment about, or asking, which other spaces, modes of thinking, and worlds of language are you looking at and experiment with to conceptualize this differently and treat nature in a qualitative way? I mean, and I just want to answer in part as representative of the kind of art wing of Sovereign Nature Initiative, and perhaps I didn't say this earlier, but I like to always say in these talks, Sovereign Nature Initiative really is a sort of three-legged stool of technology, theory, and art. And as a kind of representative of the art department, I really believe that artistic expression is a fundamental way to try to reorient human thinking to become more entangled with the more than human and non-human world, and to stop thinking of our own individuality as the only form of subjecthood or sentience or the only important thing, let's say, in the world, and to try to reorient our thinking and perspective. And that was actually an inspiration for this poetry competition, creative writing competition that Andrea mentioned in her presentation, Nature Speaks. And I wanted to mention that just yesterday I met with a jury who looked at over 75 entries in this competition. We solicited from the public around the world. Folks wrote poetry and prose from the perspective, attempting to take on the perspective of non-human life on Earth, including birds and moss and mushrooms and all manner of life on Earth. And we're going to be announcing the winners of that competition tomorrow, and we'll be publishing their work around the time of that experimental zone event in Amsterdam in May, when we'll be really collecting and gathering in person for the first time to try to see what happens when artists and theorists and inventors and technologists all get together to look at these issues. So that was a long way to answer the question, but I really believe that it's important to try to think through what it might be like to be a bat or to be a patch of moss as we start to as we try to become more entangled and think about the qualitative relationships that we have, kind of exactly as you're saying, Andrea, this question of symbiosis or relationality that could be perhaps represented, not just representing individuals, but representing their relationships. Any other thoughts about that question that Anne-Marie asked Andrea, or
Yeah, I mean, which question do you mean now?
This question, I guess, of like, what are we looking at, and how can we experiment to conceptualize this, how to treat nature in a qualitative way rather than a quantitative way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that really what is to say there is that really with this notion of qualitative value, that's like the bar is set really, really, really high in a sense of what all the things that would have to be reconceptualized so as to get to something that could then be called qualitative value is really hard. And I think that what we are trying to do at SNI at the moment is really rather an attempt of multiplying. So I think that rather than like going away and like saying, okay, here is the way of registering qualitative value, which really sounds like a nice phrase, but if you try and get down what that means, then it becomes very, 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 very difficult to do, and not just as a technical difficulty, but really as a limitations of modes of thought of trying to think that. But I think that what we do very much, or what we try to do very much, or what is the first site of going toward is a multiplication and I really think really multiplication is the best word to try and think about what kinds of different modes of value production, what kinds of value relationships can be registered. And so the way that we do that at the moment is really to try and think with this site at the Kövel and work with the people at the Kövel to have a little bit of an idea of all the things that go into making that and into sustaining that and into having this living ecosystem with all the different parts to fall back also onto the parts and entities idea. But this is really, I think, one of the things that SNI is taking very seriously, or that for me is very important for SNI, is to say that we try to work that out within the site and in the context that we are. And that is a certain kind of ecosystem. Now, where are the limits of this ecosystem? You could spin that to wherever you want. You can make the cut or no cut at all to where you want to go with that. But I do think that at least trying to have something like the Kövel that consists of the soil that is there, of the shipping industry that was there, on the history of, I mean, you can go back to the question of what kind of value was produced for this shipping industry and where did that go? Where is that now? And how is that related to what is going on at the moment? And there are the plants that do the phytoremediation. We bring in these projects that do all sorts of prototypes that engage with the site there and then produce tokens of all sorts of kinds. So it's really trying to locate it within that collective and trying to think about what that could mean in this ecosystem is where we are beginning, I think, where we are doing our work.
Well, that's great, and I love that you're bringing it back to the concrete, Andrea, and to De Kövel, where folks have been doing important ecological work for many years, and that process it is quantified already because it takes money to plant plants, and it takes it takes labor, and it takes that, and so quantification has been there from the beginning, and in some sense, Web3 and some of these technologies are coming in to try to say, okay, like. How can value actually be articulated as happening inside of the ecological health of this place? So how can that health itself, or thriving is another word we sometimes use, be somehow represented and then valued, rather than waiting around for someone to get a grant of $10 to plant more plants at the Kövel? We say, okay, there is ecological health happening. How can that value be locked into it? And then somehow feed back on itself, or somehow spin off value that in turn can feed back into the human labor necessary to cultivate, the money or resources necessary to preserve a space so that it's not exploited, etc. And so in some sense, we're trying to think about all of the tools that ecologists and environmentalists have always had, but in some sense trying to translate them into these structures, these Web3 structures or technologies.
And also, I think to be very explicit about this, I think one of the reasons why the Web3 space is interesting for a project like this at the moment, because I think very often the question also comes, so why blockchain, why technology, why do you need this? Aren't we disembedded enough? Are we not far enough already? Do we also need to go into digital technologies and work with digital technologies? But I do think that for people who are, I saw in the chat now, Gandip invoked the Dev Connect that I also mentioned at the very beginning, this gathering of blockchain people at the moment in Amsterdam. There is so much dedication, so much drive, so much energy in all senses of the word that is really currently taking shape within this world of crypto, and however you might define that. And there is a lot of openness in terms of conceptual openness. There is a lot of experimenting going on that really, in a sense, makes this idea or this question of how to think beyond what we have already thought, how to break through that we already know and just reproduce the same again, makes that, I think, more accessible. And it's really a creative, generative process in which different projects work and do their thing. I mean, this is also the way we work with the hackathons, inviting people, prompting them with certain ideas, and then trying to work with what is being created there to go beyond what we already know.
Mm. Yeah, and I want to actually flag a comment or a question from Alex earlier, and this is maybe not one that we can answer today, as so much of what we're provoking today isn't going to be answered in the next minutes, but I liked how Alex put it. Does the team have a sense of what exactly the unit of value being traded would refer to in terms of real reductions in emissions, or in terms of a quote unquote positive impact on quote unquote nature? And I really think that gets to the heart of thinking beyond our current paradigm, because there is a natural way that a lot of and very, very smart, NFT and Web3 projects are looking at carbon emissions, specifically. There's some really brilliant thinking around that and how to think beyond traditional carbon trading. But I also think we are trying to ask that even further, more philosophical question of, how can health and thriving of nature be represented beyond simply removing, let's say, trees from being cut down and their potential use or their potential carbon emissions. How can we quantify, in some sense, the quality of entanglement that we've been talking about today? And there's great notes in the chat. I want to just mention, thank you guys for diving in there. And I always love when there's multiple synapses firing in these kinds of conversations. And I also want to mention Joaco. I'm not sure if I'm saying your name right, but I love the name Fundación Cuidemos Paraísos. It's such a beautiful phrase. And I love your comment about ancient and indigenous knowledge and some concepts of entanglement that have been around for a long time that are really worth studying and reconnect with. Yeah, I do other questions specifically. There's a lot going on in the chat, so if folks want to just unmute themselves and ask. But the time we've got left, I'm really eager to open the floor to ask either SNI as a team or Andrea specifically. If you all have questions about some of our initiatives or some of these concepts we've been digging into. I'm also going to put into the chat just ways of staying in touch with us too. Not that we're wrapping up immediately, but I just want to mention kind of how you can stay in touch with us if you don't already follow us in all the places that we are posting.
I mean, I think it would also be nice, maybe, Alessandro, if you could speak a little bit about how the hackathon worked, and if you want, highlight whichever project you want to highlight from there, and maybe say a little bit about what is going to happen now with this in the Germinator program.
Sure. I had a question on intrinsic value, but I will skip it then. So yeah, we ran a hackathon in February where we invited teams from all over the world to tackle some of the challenges of this place called the Kovo that Seth and Andrea briefly mentioned. Out of 22 teams, we've selected 8 of them to participate in an incubator program to further develop some of the solutions that are presented in the hackathon. And it's hard to summarize because all of them are sort of taking their own approach towards the problems that the Kovo is facing, such as engaging volunteers and visitors with taking care of the green space of the park there, to finding ways to include nature in their decision making. So they were very open to explore that question. And the teams, I would say most of them have focused on what is called like citizen science, so engaging individuals and citizens in taking care of and understanding, first of all, their the wilder environments, even if they're urban environments, and then to help scientists take care of scientists and let's call it nature stewards to take care of nature ecosystems. So a lot of emphasis is on data collection, so development of apps and data infrastructures that can help the Kovo manage the data that is collected by them and by visitors and volunteers that work on the place. And the question of value has not been yet tackled, although we had a lot of conversations with the teams, and it's very hard. I mean, it's not very hard, it's, I guess, impossible to quantify qualitative value. It's in the word. But what the teams have tried to do is to see how technology can, if not find the qualitative value, how can it be a medium for reconnecting citizens, especially with their wild environments in their city. So there's a lot of like learning in the apps that they're developing, learning about the plants, connecting with the plants, recording audio of birds, for instance, and seeing how that those new practices can help them connect with the non-human world that somehow feels out there, but it's in us. So it was very interesting to witness that, and I'm super curious to see what they will come up with in May, because they're now really working hard on finalizing their pilots.
And maybe can I just add one thing that I really think might be interesting? So some of you might or might not have heard of solar punk as the like interesting movement, which works a lot with the idea of hope, which I also don't know if that is the greatest idea. But anyway, solar punk is a big thing. It's becoming a big thing. And I went to a meeting on this today of solar punk in the crypto space, which really is all about an ecological future and living in harmony with nature in the future, but in a tech savvy way. So not a nostalgia for the past, but really like relying on technologies for building livable futures. But one of the things that very often I think is a concern is that today also one of the questions that we were asked in the workshop was, how can we improve the availability of exit strategies for people who want to live solar punk lives? And so that was a little bit of a conversation in my mini group today, because on the one hand, the moderator made a very big effort of saying it must be so that everyone can live a solar punk life. And yet on the other hand, there was this word exit in the phrase. And so I think that a little bit of the question of what is the escape fantasy in techno future ideas, and how to engage with that. And so I think SNI really is trying to position itself very much against the idea of an exiting, of an escaping, of being site specific. So these projects that were developed through the hackathon really are projects then that say, okay, so this is the site de Kövel, this is the way it works and it rolls, and it is in this place, and to try and work with things that are happening there, so as to not, in a sense, fall for this idea of let's build a bright, shiny future and let's not think about what else is left behind and how that is left behind. So it's really the idea of staying with the trouble, to invoke a book title by Donna Haraway, to really try and stay in this mess and try to work within this, and not go for escapist fantasies. And I think when we speak metaverse, when we speak digitality, when we speak virtual realities, escapism comes so easy and is so close. So I think that there is a lot to be said about trying to resist that, and how to do that well without having to let go of the idea that technology has a role to play, and without having to fall back into nostalgic ideas of we should live the way we lived 2,000 years ago or something like that.
Yeah, it's a profound question. Thank you, Andrea. That was beautifully articulated. The escapism fantasy, relating also to the strand of utopianism in some science fiction or technology thinking, but that we can somehow opt out of this planet and pick a different one, or go somewhere else in some cases, or just simply transform this one so that we can leave all of the mess behind. And it's interesting to think about that middle, maybe in a sense, middle path between utopian and dystopian thinking about the future that manifests in literature. And I know there are a lot of, within the solar punk literature space, and also generally in science fiction, I think there's been a turn in the last few years away from the kind of, pure dystopianism of kind of climate catastrophe towards a question, not to be, again, Pollyanna-ish about it, but to say, let's actually confront the world that we really do have, and the technologies that we really might have, and how we really might live. Again, not to paint too rosy of a picture of the future, but to ask truly about what technology might be able to enable in terms of a more balanced planet in terms of humans and their interactions with nature. So yeah, folks have literature they want to recommend in the chat. Please pop it in there, and I'll try to gather a couple of links as we're wrapping up our time together today and pop those in as well. Any other questions that have come up that folks want to throw out there? It's just want to plug again the if you are local to Amsterdam, or if you're in Europe or want to travel to Amsterdam for our event on May 21st, it's part of a kind of overall project that we have to try to gather folks together to think through these things. And so actually that weekend of May 21st, we're going to be having a theory session with some leading thinkers, including Andrea around the University of Amsterdam. We're also going to have a big kind of tech gathering at the conclusion on that Sunday. But that Saturday, the 21st, is really our chance to try to articulate and present some of these ideas for the public, and you can tell even in this conversation, there's so much abstraction and so much thinking in this work, but we really want to show, and to Alessandro's point and Andrea's point about how to make it concrete, some of these apps and technologies in beta mode, in operation at Decouple, at this place, to try to benefit this place and its ecological health. And so on May 21st, this experimental zone, we hope will be a place where the rubber will hit the road with some of these ideas. And if you can come, please do come and check out the work that's being developed, trying to answer some of these questions. There's some questions in the chat too about, Joaco asked about conservation models. I think that's super interesting, and maybe that's a good final kind of question to gather as a group, and then we wrap it up, if that's okay. I think the question that Joaco mentioned is, and I wondered if anybody from the SNI team wants to chime in, talking about buying lands for conservation in Chile. Is it possible to use a DAO to buy the land? How might we think from a kind of Web3 perspective about a way to quantify the forest, to buy it and protect it? Any thoughts about that, about kind of conservation or land trusts from the group?
I'm currently exploring all of this, so I'll try. I can bring an example of how with Web3 some folks in Portugal managed to help farmers to fund an agroforestry. So it was basically they looked at like an investor that is interested in just making money out of the carbon market. So like just speculative interest would be funding the agroforest that is grown into the piece of land of this farmer. The proceeds of coming from the carbon offsets of that thriving forest will go to the investor, this third party that invested in this farm, but the farmer himself would take the advantage of the proceeds from the actual physical fruits, or if it's a forest big enough that tourists are interested in visiting, the proceeds are coming from tourism and so on. And I thought that was and all of this is very transparent. So the monitoring of the carbon sequestered, it's on a transparent ledger, and the amount of, for instance, the access to markets for the farmer itself is all tokenized. So I can recommend. It's called RM Terra, the project. And I thought it was just a nice way to, align incentives in some way using Web3 tools. There are some great community. There's quite a lot happening in Portugal for some reason of buying land through crypto, but I'm currently exploring. I can keep you posted. I'll put my email there so we can exchange contacts, and I'll keep you posted on what I find. It's such a new field that it's hard to give examples that have been there more than maybe 2 or 3 months.
It's great. It's
There you go.
yeah,
Thanks.
Thanks, Ale. Yeah, put your chat, put your contact in the chat, and feel free to follow up with Alessandro. Andrea, you had a thought on a concluding question to tackle.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just wanted to pick up Alex's question from the chat on what to do with property relations, commoning, how to think that through, and what is the role of tokens and token economics there. And I really do think that, to me, the idea is that this is where we want to draw in all sorts of people. So I think that the idea is not that SNI knows it all and has it all and will know it all. It's really, there are people who have been working on the questions of commons and commoning, also with the question of local currencies. I have a dear colleague and academic friend and researcher who is working on these questions of money and alternative currencies and commoning. So I want to use that from Alex to say that what I also think that SNI is very special in and wants to continue doing that is that really it's an open door for researchers who are in academia. I mean, I'm an academic myself. I do really think that there is so much knowledge and so much thinking and so much really comprehensive, deep knowledge in the academic space. And the formats in which research is undertaken within academia is often very constraining, and not to speak about how academia would relate to the crypto space. And walking that line, depending on which side you are in and where you are at, is not always that easy. So selling the idea of interesting crypto research in academic spaces often takes a little bit of work until then the engine turns on and then everyone is in and in for it. But this is really just to say that part of the SNI dedication to theory and to research to make it as important of an undertaking of the project as the tech development, which is equally important, and as the art immersive experiences, which are also equally important, is to say it would be fantastic to keep thinking about these questions, and in particular, so the theory hacks that SNI supported around the question of representations and now radical contracting is really only the first iteration of this kind of format, and there should be more formats of this kind in which the subjects then will turn more on questions of political economy. So that is something that is on the agenda to really try and think through, and probably the most intuitive way in would be to think through commoning as a question of political economy and what that can do and how that can go. So Alex, come and join us.
Yeah, thanks for the great questions, Alex. And I just popped in the chat like, yeah, I love this big question. It's a great one to leave on. Is like, what's the point of all this? What are we trying for? What are we trying to get to? And I was sort of posing again further questions back. Entanglement, interdependence, thriving, health. I think those are really great kind of questions to leave with, and I'm really glad we were able to touch both on this token economics question and this quantity quality, really amazingly complicated and fun question to keep asking, but also some of these issues towards the end about things like both the rights of nature and also schemes of their protectionism or ways of acknowledging legally or protecting, let's say, nature and whether and how we can build on or rethink that model for seeking ecological health for the planet. Thank you so much, Andrea, and thank you everybody for attending today. Follow us please on social media. I posted a little earlier, to find out about the results of our Nature Speaks creative writing competition that'll be announced tomorrow on Earth Day, and stay in touch with us as well about upcoming talks like this. Spread the word, please, and thank you so much again for joining us. Any final thoughts from other members of the SNI team as we depart?
From me, just a huge thank you to Andrea and Seth for this great talk. Always a pleasure to hear you, and thank you for dedicating your time. And to all of those who came out and joined this lively conversation, I think there's much more to learn, and I think we need to have you in our community to continue to learn from each other.
Super cool. Well, then let me say thank you to everyone for coming, for showing up, for discussing, for thinking with, and let's be certain that this is just the beginning of doing more of this. Very cool. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everybody.